Hi, I'm Rebecca Giblin. I'm the head of the Authors' Interest Research Project. We're looking at what would happen if the author's interest in copyright was actually taken seriously. What kind of thinking could that unlock, not only for helping to get authors paid, but also for reclaiming some of the cultural value that's lost under current approaches? I'm here today with Cory Doctorow, one of my favourite writers and thinkers. He's currently in Australia on tour with his new book, Walkaway. We're going to be talking around the project's themes and sort of seeing where that takes us. So, Cory, welcome back to Australia.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
We're really starting from this point where we've got global writers' organisations who have been advocating for serious reform of authors' contracts and contractual practice with publishers. And that's come out of these quite startling declines in authors' incomes over time. Some of the headline amounts from some of the big studies in Australia, we see the median amount earned from writing reported at $2,800. We've seen in the UK the most professional full-time writers earning well below the minimum income standard, and also, quite a scary trend that there has been a reduction in the number of full-time professional writers who can make a living from their writing from 40% to 11.5% in just 8 years. And you've talked before about the irrational nature of art markets. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that plays into these income declines that we might be seeing.
I think that it makes it illustrates a really interesting point about how we think about who is and who isn't a legitimate artist. So when you start with the people who are making a living in the arts, there's this implication that they are broadly representative of the people who've tried to make a living in the arts. And the reality is, in my whole career as a writer, and in all the careers of all the writers who ever mentored me, every person I've ever met knew in their bones that the vast majority of people who were talented and who were driven, who set out to earn a living from writing, would earn either nothing or near as makes no damn from their writing over their entire careers. That's been a really well understood phenomenon, at least in the genre that I work in science fiction, for its whole time. And what we have now is maybe a situation in which the top tier has gotten smaller. But when you say it's a 40% reduction or a 30% reduction or an 11% reduction or whatever that number is, I think we're still talking about very small numbers. I mean, every now and again, I'll go through the Science Fiction Writers of America directory, and I count, on the order of 50 people earning a good middle-class full-time living from doing nothing but writing. Now, Robert Silverberg very famously says that, as far as he knows, he's the only writer in the history of science fiction whose income exclusively came from writing from the beginning of his working life. So, we are talking about really small numbers, but at the same time, it does highlight this really important policy question, which is, even though only a small number of people are making a living in the arts, how are the fruits of their labor being divided up? And there's definitely an issue of fundamental justice there, right? If there is money being made from your work and some other piece of the supply chain is benefiting from it, to the point where you're seeing a serious reduction in your quality of life, your ability to work, or what have you, then how can we intervene in the policy sphere to make sure that there's more of that? And I think there's two ways that works out. One is that we can make direct policy interventions where we can say things like, you have an inalienable right to certain levels of compensation, certain clauses in contracts are unconscionable, we have statutory percentages of certain kinds of collecting society fees or what have you that have to go directly to the artist and can't be assigned to an agent or another rights holder, another person in the chain. And that has its place. I'm all for it. There's another part, which is how do we, in that domain that will not be statutorily defined, which I think is by definition going to be most of the bargaining that writers do in the market, how do we give those writers the greatest chance of bargaining for the greatest piece of the money? And I think that generally we have done a very poor job in that latter domain. And we often sacrifice that domain of negotiating power, in the service of ensuring that more money flows to the artist through statutory instruments. Like we may create statutory frameworks that make it harder for new companies to enter the market. And so with fewer publishers in the market, there's less competition for writers. And that means that just as a matter of kind of raw economics, if there's fewer people bidding on your book, the worst deal you get is going to be worse than if there were more people potentially bidding on your book. I think, you know, in particular in internet policy domains, the floor on the worst offer that the big 5 publishers can give you, or even the big 5 plus the boutique houses can give you, is your rational expectation of how well you might do if you tried to go it on your own. If you tried to assemble a publisher out of raw material you found lying around on the internet, a payment processor here, a ebook retailer there, you know, someone else who does some kind of marketing services or what have you, your reasonable belief about how you'll fare there is the point at which you turn around and walk out of the negotiating room when your publisher makes an offer on your book. When we make those firms less competitive, right? When we create regulatory hurdles that they have to surpass that are very expensive for them to exist in the market, we generally don't weaken their market power. You know, no one's ever going to say to Google, you must now come under a regulation that makes Google, you know, ineffective at being Google. What we may say is we're going to make Google labor under a regime that would stop someone from starting another firm that might someday compete with Google, a regime that Google 10 years ago could have never risen to. And what that means is that Google becomes like the permanent god emperor of this, right? I mean, one place where we saw that is with the Google book scanning lawsuit, where the Authors Guild struck a deal on behalf of all the authors everywhere, including Australian authors and Canadian authors and academic authors and so on, that would have allowed Google to effectively become the only people who are allowed to scan and distribute books for a relatively small amount of money, about $70 million.
Yeah.
And that would have meant that we just never would have had competition for searching books. And if you believe that there's monetization possible for searching, which I'm skeptical about, or if you believe that given a robust searchable market, that there might be some market advantage for someone doing something else, right? Like the ability to search might end up selling books. No one will pay to search books, but they might buy books having searched. That making Google the sole source of book searching is a really bad matter of public policy for authors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it makes us perpetual sharecroppers, even if the Authors Guild and the big 5 publishers all think that that sounds like a good idea for the next quarter. It is not a good deal for authors in perpetuity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we look at the bargaining power of authors, and it's really interesting when we look at the studies in cultural economics in particular, the study of creative labour markets, to have a look at the bargaining power that is there as a result of, you know, the highly desirable nature of creative work, the fact that authors are so often willing to provide creative labour for less than other forms of labour. And then what that kind of results in. And so, you know, maximizing the choices available, I think, are really essential to improving those outcomes. One of my favorite illustrations of this, actually, the difficulties that creators can face, is there's this standard form Hollywood contract. And it requires the creator to hand over all of their rights in full, in perpetuity. And not just throughout the planet Earth, but throughout the universe at large.
And in all media now known and yet to be invented.
That's right. So you get a lucrative extraterrestrial market ever emerge. It's not actually going to be the artist that makes the money.
Yeah, and so this irrationality, I mean, you could call it highly desirable. I mean, I'm a little. I think that there are times when I enjoy writing. I think I mostly enjoy having written, but I think that it's a largely involuntary reflex for me, and for, you know, I occasionally teach writers. I'm not very bullish on writing instruction. I think that it has its place, but a little goes a long way. But when I've had these talented, amazing students, I see that not only does writing make them feel good, but it makes them stop feeling bad, right? That like writing is this like highly therapeutic thing. You know, we make art, you know, the way ants build hills. You know, it really seems intrinsic to our condition. Like there's whole domains of psychotherapy just based around teaching people with incredibly debilitating psychological illnesses to make art as a therapeutic intervention. And it's really effective, right? So that kind of creative labor, you know, there's that old, you know, cliche, you know, I write because I can't stop, you know, not because it makes me feel good, but because when I don't do it, I feel so bad. Yeah. And that is definitely produces a situation that's ripe for exploitation.
Yeah.
Right? And it's one of the reasons that there's been doctrines of unconscionability in artistic contracts and various frameworks for a very long time. You know, the continental conception of the inalienable moral right and so on. It's out of a recognition that art markets tend to produce gatekeepers who are kind of winner-take-all gatekeepers who then control access to audiences, and then the artists who show up hat in hand at their doors asking to have their work be brought to an audience are in a very poor bargaining position and often negotiate away everything, even below the floor at which maybe they could have said, no, that's too far for me. They might have been able to continue going forward, but they were just so desperate that they went there.
And those gatekeepers, they are starting to melt away in some respect. You know, they say that everybody has a book in them, and we can now read all of those books because certainly with the advent of self-publishing, some really interesting new statistics coming out suggesting in 2015 there were twice as many US self-published books that had ISBNs than what the traditional publishing industry was producing. And that's a dramatic underestimation because so many self-published books don't have ISBNs at all. And it got me thinking really about these notions of scarcity and abundance that really permeate your books. We've now got with ebooks, marginal cost of distribution, production and global distribution of basically zero. And I've seen very often publishers responding to authors' claims for a bigger share of rights blame the increased number of authors as one of the contributing factors to incomes going down. So I wanted to get your thoughts. What do you think? Is it a feature or is it a bug that you can write a book and you can make it available to everybody?
I think you have to put on different hats to figure out the answer to that question. So if you're playing like sim cultural regulator and you're trying to design a cultural system and you want to measure whether it's working, one of the metrics that I think is hard to argue with is we want a diversity of creators making a diversity of works to reach a diversity of audiences. So I remember during the height of the hype around blogging, there was a service that kicked off called Technorati that started to measure blogging audiences. And they found that the majority of blogs, more than 50%, had 3 or fewer inbound links from the rest of the world, implying, and given that to some approximation, everybody who was reading blogs was also writing blogs, links were a good proxy for whether you were being read. And there were a lot of people who pointed at that and said, look at how naked the emperor is, right? Blogging is not a mass medium. Mostly it's one person writing for 2 people. But there's another vision of that, which is that historically it was so uneconomical for one person to write for 2 people that it just didn't happen unless those 2 people were like a Medici and a Pope.
Or
right?
there were letters, right? Like people used to write one for one, an extraordinary amount of time.
But these are strangers, right? These are presumably strangers, right? There's a lot of this. There's a lot of strangers finding each other in these very tiny markets. So on the one hand, as a matter of cultural policy, if you have 10x the ISBNs being issued to books that find a very small audience, but that audience was historically never served adequately, that they've found something that really matters to them, that speaks to them on metrics that are different from the historic metrics, so maybe the production values aren't as high, maybe the sub-editors aren't as good, maybe the writer just is not as much of a prose stylist, but they have something that speaks directly to the experience of the audience. We all know this as artists, that there are things that speak directly to your experience as a member of the artist, and the audience rather, in like the most raw, crude way. The art your children draw has merits that are independent of the execution and that have to do with the context. And art markets are all about context, right? The Duchamp's urinal or whatever. It's not a radical thing to say that the context of this work matters. And really, replacing your children's art on the fridge with paintings by professionals is never going to be a good trade-off, right? That there's that metric on which it's important. So yes, let's celebrate that, right? Let's celebrate that we now have markets, platforms, and systems that allow for works that are much more narrowly targeted to reach people to whom they speak more deeply. On the other hand, we also have, through these platforms, a monopolization of all of the services to the authors that allow those works to reach audiences, that they have become vertically and horizontally integrated and global in a way that leaves authors with very little bargaining power and makes them vulnerable to exploitative practices on the parts of the platforms, often in collusion with the traditional publishing industry. So it's often the case that platforms and publishing will come together to agree on a set of practices that don't necessarily benefit the creators. In the music domain, there's some really good examples of this. You know, when YouTube Music kicked off to compete with Spotify, the big four labels met with YouTube, which is Google, and agreed a set of terms for streaming audio. And then Google went to all of the independent musicians that had used YouTube to promote their careers and said, you will take the deal the big four just negotiated, or you are no longer welcome on YouTube in any form, right? And you know, they don't have the same interests, they don't have the same economics, they don't have the same interests, but they become beholden to them. You know, I always compare it to the last scene in Animal Farm. You look from the pigs to the farmers and you can't tell the difference anymore. You know, the thing that I think when we talk about artists' incomes that's important to look at is not whether you are worried about big content or big tech. It's about whether you have negotiating leverage against big business. Ultimately, both of those, you know, the big tech sector and the big publishing sector, or big entertainment sector, are owned by the same shareholders, right? The same institutional shareholders are trousering the dividends from both of those, with a few exceptions. Macmillan is still privately held and so on. But in the main, these are publicly listed firms that are doing business, and they are not on your side, even if you're on their side, unless they have to be. And you know, Amazon does great services to authors as a sales platform. I'm a recovering bookseller. I worked for, you know, shitty mall stores, and I worked for independent academic stores, and I worked for a science fiction store, and I have never seen anyone be better at selling books than Amazon. It's very hard to dispute that Amazon is good at selling books, but Amazon is not selling books out of the sense of duty that we had as independent booksellers, right? There are plenty of people who work at Amazon who feel that duty, but Amazon is like a transhuman artificial life form that uses humans as its gut flora, does not care about selling books. And if fridges make more money than books, then the books will be jettisoned and the fridges will be shunted in to take their place. And they are perfectly happy to change the deal in a way that takes authors who found some happy place to be and move it somewhere else. A good example would be DRM in audiobooks. Amazon bought Audible, the leading audiobook vendor in the world. They used their own institutional nous to make it even bigger. It now constitutes 90% of English language audiobook sales. And they had a mandatory policy of DRM on the audiobooks so that it became unlawful if you were an audiobook customer to unlock your audiobook library and follow a favorite author to another platform. Well, I think the authors tired of the platform before the publishers did. There were a lot of authors who wished that they could take a deal with someone else or independently sell their audiobooks, but the audience didn't want to follow them. They didn't want to give up their audiobook libraries or maintain two separate incompatible libraries. And then eventually the publishers wised up, and Random House Audio and the other big audiobook publishers woke up one day and discovered they too had become sharecroppers in Amazon, and they were just as locked in as Amazon was. Ebooks happened the same way. Amazon eventually did drop its requirement for ebooks out of the antitrust suit and Macmillan's insistence that they do so. But Hachette, who had the most strong commitment to DRM of any ebook publisher, when Macmillan said that some of its authors would be allowed to drop DRM from their ebooks, Hachette sent letters to all the agents saying, I don't care if your author is a Tor author in some other territory. If there's any territory in which they're doing business with Hachette, they may not do this. And that left us all locked into Amazon's platform and vulnerable to the shocks that Amazon might visit upon us. Hachette thought that they'd tricked Amazon into putting DRM on the audiobooks. Amazon had tricked Hachette into putting DRM in their audiobooks. And it's not a coincidence that Hachette's CEO just said that the age of the audiobook or the ebook is past because people just don't seem to be interested in them anymore. Yeah, well, your ebooks sucked, right? They were all crippled and locked to Kindles.
Yeah, that's right. And we've now got so many people in this position. They've invested in creating a library, whether of books or ebooks, on Kindle. That's happened as a result of these decisions that were made a long time ago about DRM. Everybody is now complaining about big tech and Amazon. But to fix this, we need to be able to unlock everybody out of this so they can take their book somewhere else.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that if you're an author, here's what your pyramid of value should look like. Thinking up the book and writing it down, the most important task. Giving you money for having done it, the second most important task. Formatting a text file and taking a credit card for it, the least important task. And so decision-making, authority, power, pricing, value should flow in that direction. But right now, DRM means that the whip hand over the publishers is held by Amazon. And a lack of competition and a lack of antitrust enforcement and the way copyright law is currently constituted means that the publishers have the whip hand over the authors. And the authors are last in line instead of first. And I'm all for let's getting authors paid, but let's not let the publishers use us as their pawns to rebalance what fraction they and the and big tech split among them when we end up with the same crumbs at the end of the day.
Right. Tell me about Shut Up and Take My Money.
Yeah. Well, so this was a way to try and, square the circle a little with ebooks and audiobooks that, electronic files, which, as you say, have no marginal cost. They have production costs, but they don't have any marginal cost to sell. So my books are sold all over the world by different publishers. In the Anglosphere, there's usually two publishers split, Macmillan and HarperCollins usually. But outside the Anglosphere, the English language rights are open territory. So if you're a Swede and you want to read in English, and every Swede I've met speaks better English than I do, you can buy my book from any publisher that wants to sell it, and no publisher has the exclusive rights to sell it. I can sell the books in Sweden too. And the way that should work out is that you go to Amazon.se and they list all the editions and you buy your favorite, and then I get paid. The way it works out in practice is Amazon SE goes, I can't figure out who has the rights here. And they throw their hands up and say, you're not allowed to buy this book. Now, Swedes invented the Pirate Bay. If you tell them that they're not allowed to buy a book, they just get it for free, right? And that's exactly what happens. And so I understood that. And I also understood that for the 20% of people who buy 80% of the audiobooks, the ebooks, they know exactly how to get those books for free. They are making voluntary payments whether or not it's priced on a pay-what-you-like basis. They really don't have to buy anything if they don't want to. And that's never going to change. Bits aren't going to get harder to copy anytime in our future. Computers are copying machines, right? A computer that doesn't make copies is like water that's not wet. So I recognize that everything that I did that made me money was due to suasion and not coercion. Right? Threatening people didn't make them pay for my books. It just made them either go elsewhere or choose not to pay for my books but continue to read them. And so I created a platform that allowed people to buy books from me on behalf of my publishers. So I'm the retailer, I'm the Amazon of the Cory Doctorow oeuvre, and I trouser the 30% that Amazon would normally take. I remit the 70% to whichever publisher is due the money. So I figure out where you are when you buy the book, and I give the money to my US publisher if you're in the US, my Commonwealth publisher in the Commonwealth. If you're not in the Commonwealth of the US, I take all the money and put it in my pocket. And then my publisher sends me 25% back, right? That's my royalty. So I've doubled my royalty, at least, more when you count in foreign markets for those. I've given people a reason to differentiate among the different markets. So, buying an ebook from Amazon or Barnes & Noble is effectively the same thing, right? There's no reason not to buy it from one or the other. The experience is the same. Buying an ebook from the author actually makes a material difference. People do feel a personal relationship to the authors that they love. Not to every author that they read, but to the authors that they feel most strongly about. They want to figure out how to benefit them most intensely. So that's a sales pitch I can make that no one else in the world can make. And it does benefit the entire value chain. My agent is an amazing agent who does incredible things for me. And if I were to just self-publish, I would be drafting on his work because the deals that he's doing with Macmillan are creating a profile for me that causes people to buy my independently published work, which then he wouldn't get his 15% out of. And Macmillan is putting heart and soul into promoting my works, as is HarperCollins, as is Head of Zeus. Here I am in Australia, I haven't been bought a plane ticket by a publisher, and so they get their recognition too, but I'm in the driver's seat. I have the whip hand, and it's been working really well. And then where I have publishers that are more flexible, I'm able to do a pay what you like on those books. So, there's an awful lot of people who choose zero. I assume that those are the people who can, who would happily have just gone to the Pirate Bay and got the book for free. People who've chosen zero can come back later and give me more. Many have done that, and a significant number of those pay over the odds. So they take a book whose suggested retail is $15. They say that they'll pay $0 for it when they download it, and they come back and give me $20 for it later, having decided that it was a good bargain. And again, like, it's about moral suasion, right? I would rather have these people inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in, and performing my trust of them creates a reciprocal sensibility, not in every audience member, but that's the truth of most literary relationships, but in a small number of audience members who become very deeply committed to my success and my future.
And it's just such a pity, because we see how dramatically the costs of taking payments, processing payments, have come down over the last few years. There would be potential for some kind of authors co-op for authors who don't necessarily have your technical skills to be able to set something like this up, but participate in and get some of that 30% if we didn't have this lock-in to Amazon that came about through the DRM.
Yeah, I launched this store last year with this ebook, with the new novel I'm touring, and this is kind of the last bit of the tour here in Australia. When it's done and when the dust settles a little, and we're going to clean up the code and release it as open source free software that anyone can hook up and host. And my hope is that people will host it for other authors, that they'll say, like, either as a free service or a service that they'll charge money for, they'll host your ebook store for you that you get all the money from.
So with all of this fear that's around the copyright reform debates in Australia, I really understand those, because I think the precariousness of trying to make a living as an author, with that increasing, any kind of threat that comes where it suggests you might conceivably get still less is obviously really scary, But of course, it's a fact that there's certain kinds of work that copyright rewards very well. The James Pattersons of this world does not have to worry about these questions. So if the market doesn't give us the kinds of works that some of us might like to have, what's the role for government intervention? What kind of useful government interventions do you think there are?
Yeah, I think that modifying contract terms, having a period after which the copyright has to be renewed, or that where a copyright can be claimed back. I think that direct art subsidy, right now we have these indirect art subsidies in the form of, like, giving people a subsidy to go to uni to get a degree and write a novel at the same time. I think we could just dispense, like, yes, let's keep university professors employed too, but just give them grants.
Give them grants, give them fellowships, directly support the writing.
And I do want to say one last thing, which is that when we talk about limitations and exceptions to copyright, we're talking about free expression, right? We're talking about, like, when we say, well, we don't want people to make a song out of a poem without permission, what we're saying is ultimately we don't want people to make songs under certain conditions. And I am an incredibly lucky author, right? I am in the 1% of 1%, and I dreamed all my life of being that author. And I got lucky beyond my wildest dreams. And every day I wake up and I'm thankful for that. But I'm an artist, and I am by definition on the side of free expression, and I'm against censorship. And creating rules about who gets to say what is anathema to my identity as an artist. And if I had to get a real job and stop making money as a novelist in order to preserve the space for free expression, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Because as much as I want to be able to, like, bequeath to my daughter the royalties from my books, I want to bequeath her a world in which free expression is a primary value, much more so.
Cory, thank you so much for your time and for coming in today.
Thank you.